What's up, guys? I'm here with my replica Hawken flintlock. I've got a close-up here just of the lock and the trigger. I always wondered how a double set trigger worked. I got this gun, I shot it some, I kind of just did my thing and played with it. And the last time I was cleaning it, I decided to delve into the lock, play with the adjustment on the trigger, and kind of see what it would do. And here I am. So I want to do a quick video tonight and show you the trigger pull on this gun and what these triggers do, and kind of explain if you're in the market for a muzzle loader, if you ever see a muzzle loader and you're interested in buying it and you don't know what these two triggers do, I kind of want to go over that. So anyway, here we go, guys. I'm on my workbench where I do a lot of my work, and I've got this thing laid out here. So first of all, our flintlock has a half cock. Okay, this locks everything up in place for you to load, for you to do whatever, and this thing can't budge. You will break the lock trying to get this thing to go forward from this position, and I'll show you that in a minute. I'll take the gun apart and show you that. But anyways, half cock and then full cock. Okay, and if this were a percussion gun, you'd put a cap on the nipple, and then you could be good to go. Here you'll prime the pan. So you've got our pan here. It's nice and clean because I just cleaned it the other day from shooting. But you'd prime this with some really fine powder. You'd close your frizzen, and voila, you're ready to shoot. Now you have two options. I'm going to show you option one. Option one is to pull the front trigger. And I've got my trusty trigger gauge here. We're set at 0. And I'm going to pull that front trigger. So I'm going to get this pull gauge on there, and I'm going to pull till it goes. Okay, and you see all the sparks, hopefully. And you get a pretty respectable trigger, to be honest, with a little travel, 4 pounds and 15 ounces. Let's call it basically a 5-pound trigger. And that's, to me, a respectable trigger pull. Okay? Now, option 2, you cock your hammer, or as some people would say, you pull your cock all the way back. So this is typically considered the cock, and this is the hammer. But anyway, most folks just call this a hammer, and that's fine. And you're going to pull this rear trigger instead. Listen for the click. Okay, this is a set trigger, and if you ever see a muzzle loader with two triggers, the rear trigger is a set trigger. It doesn't set the gun off. What it does is you're walking through the woods hunting, a deer or whatever jumps out at you, you yank the front trigger, gun goes off. But it's further away, it doesn't see you, you have lots of time, and you want to get set up for a shot. You pull the rear trigger and you set the front trigger. Now what that does is that makes the front trigger a hair trigger. And so I'm going to 0 my trigger pull gauge, and I'm going to pull this front trigger again and show you just how much of a hair trigger. 5.9 ounces. Okay, so less than 6 ounces. And I have gotten as low as 4 from this thing. So anyway, that is the purpose of the set trigger. Now, there are some older guns, if you go to pull this back, the hammer will not come back, and people will think that they're broken. Some of your older guns, especially guns that are antiques, now this is a reproduction. All of your modern reproductions will go half cock, full cock. Okay? A lot of your older guns don't have a half cock. And some of your older guns, if you go to pull this back, will just do this. There will be no, and you'll say, oh man, that lock is broken. And if you set it first, then you can pull it back. So some older guns, you actually have to set the rear trigger before you can cock the lock. So if you see an older gun, if it's a true antique firearm, and you're interested in it, and you say, oh, the lock is broken because it won't lock back, set the rear trigger first, and then see if it'll lock back. And a lot of times it will, and if that's the case, it's not broken. That's just how it was designed to be used. You had to set that rear trigger for the lock to lock back in the firing position. So anyway, I'm going to take the lock off. So all I'm going to do is take this one screw goes all the way through the stock and holds the lock on. I'm going to take that screw off and show you this mechanism and explain to you how that set trigger works. All right, so we're back. I've got the lock off. You can see here's where the barrel goes into the barrel channel, into the breech and all that. So that's all locked in. You have to take that out. That just comes out with a barrel wedge that's up here. But anyway, so here's your lock, and I'll show you how this guy works. So you go to pull back on your lock, and you get this cam. So it's a spring-loaded cam. And this is a CVA gun. Every gun is different. A lot of them will just have a notch here. This is a modern gun. Has this cool cam here. And what happens is your sear, so this is your mechanism that fires the lock. And this goes in here, and it locks in between this main piece here and this little cam. And this is half cock. And nothing you do, I mean, this thing's not budging. You can't pull the trigger. You can't push it forward. Your only option is to pull it further back. Now it rotates that cam all the way around, okay? And now you're set. This is your sear. This is your firing mechanism. And this guy has to be pushed this way, up. So in the gun, this would actually be pushed up, okay? So that gets pushed up. See if you can see that there. So there it is engaged. And when you push that up, it trips the lock. And all of that goes by, and boom, sets off the gun. And this could be percussion or flintlock, doesn't matter. It's the same way. It all works the same way. Okay? So, and this big spring that's compressed right now, that's your main spring. Okay? So if you ever needed to replace that, that's what you'd be ordering, is a main spring. Okay? So that's your main spring there. And then this little guy out here that lets your frizzen flip back and forth is your frizzen spring. So that's the two springs that are in most of your locks. Okay, so now to the gun. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here into this hole. And when I pull the trigger, you're going to see this blade come up. Okay, and that blade pushes up on this bar. Okay, so that's how your front trigger works. So that's what, now, let me show you your rear trigger. And you can't see what's going on down in this hole very well. But when I pull this rear trigger, there's a bar there. And this rear trigger goes down and puts tension. So there's a spring in here. And what's happening is that bar is now under tension. Okay, and when I pull the front trigger, watch what happens. See that just pop up very rapidly? I'll do it again. Watch it pop up rapidly. Pop. So what happens when you set this rear trigger is when you hit this front trigger, this guy snaps up rapidly, and it's the effect of jerking the trigger, only it's happening internal to the gun. You're not the one jerking the trigger, and so it doesn't disturb your sight picture. So anyway, so it's basically a spring-loaded mechanism that goes off that causes the trigger to trip very rapidly. So you're not lightening the pressure here in the lock, but you're actually using kind of a mousetrap here to trip and hit that lock and set it off. So that's kind of a cool thing. Now, let's talk about adjustment. There is an adjustment screw. It's very, very tiny, and it's right here. Okay, there's an adjustment screw here. Okay, and the way this guy typically works on most guns, and the best thing you can do is play with it. And the way to play with it would be to take off this guard. So I'm going to take off this guard, and I'm going to play with it, and I'm going to show you what it does. Okay. All right, so I've got my trigger guard off, and I've got my little screw and my screwdriver here, and I want to show you what happens. We'll zoom in just a little bit. When I put a screwdriver in this screw and I tighten it, I want you to watch the front trigger, okay? And you're going to see it move, okay? What that's doing, that's actually putting tension on the mechanism. It's moving this trigger. And so you've got this notch here, okay? You see this guy here. This little flat sits against the mechanism of the front trigger. And as you move this front trigger back, sometimes you actually make it. So actually I can, well, right now, this is about where it should be, okay? So this is where it should be, and it takes very little travel for the front trigger to set the rear trigger. And that's what you want. If I tighten it too much, watch the front trigger continue to move back. Okay, you'll see the front trigger continue to move back. Hopefully you can see that. I go to set it, and it's just going to be barely, almost unsafe. That's like I barely touch it. And if I turn this a little tighter, okay, you turn it in too much, here's what happens. This front trigger has moved so far back in its travel that there's not room in the mechanism. So the rear trigger is disabled. Okay, so if you don't want to use the set trigger, if you tighten this screw up enough, it actually disables it, that you cannot set the set trigger. Okay, now if I loosen it, here's what happens. Let me loosen it way up to where it was when I started. And again, you'll see the front trigger move forward this time. As I loosen it, you'll see that front trigger move forward. Okay, if I move this way, 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 way out, almost too far, almost lost my screw there. Okay, this actually sets really deep down in the groove. So let me pop this up here again and point. So this little guy here sits way, way, way down in the groove against the trigger, almost too far. And watch what happens to set the trigger off. I actually have to move, watch how far I have to move the front trigger to set this off. Okay, you see all that travel. In a modern trigger, we would call that creep. And so what you're trying to do, guys, is you're trying to set this screw so that this trigger, as soon as it moves rearward, sets the gun off. There's no creep. So this would be a very poor set trigger, because look at how much movement I get before the gun sets off, okay? So that would be very poor, so we want to tighten this up. And there's no right answer to this other than to play with it and get it to where you're happy. So let me see. So watch this movement. Very little movement of the trigger. Okay, very little movement of the trigger. I'd like to take just a hair more movement out. Okay, just a hair more movement. So I'm going to tighten this up maybe another half a turn. Set, and let's see. Beautiful. Watch how much movement before the trigger breaks. None. As soon as you move that trigger rearward, it breaks. That's what I'm looking for in a set trigger. Okay, so as soon as I move this back, bang. Okay, so then we just put our trigger guard back on, put our screws back in place, put our lock back on. Voila, we've got our set trigger set. So anyway, if you've ever looked at a muzzle loader that had set triggers and you had questions about it, if you didn't know what they did, if you just weren't sure, I hope that answers it. And they're fun. This is a flintlock. I do also own this gun in percussion. They are both CVA brand guns. Unfortunately, I don't think CVA makes either of the guns anymore, but they're really cool guns, and they are a lot of fun to shoot. They are exceptionally accurate guns, and hopefully that answers some of your questions about it. I'm going to go ahead and put my trigger guard back on. If you have questions about set triggers or muzzle loaders or anything like that, please leave it in the comments or shoot me an email. I'm glad to answer them. I hope it's helped some folks. And I'm going to get this thing put back together, get the lock put back on, and go put it back on the wall where I keep it. And I really do appreciate your support, guys. Thanks for watching. And please like and subscribe.